talk in the Critical Border Studies speaking series for the year, but we just hope to be continuing on next year. So I want to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Jennifer Hyndman. She's a professor here at York in the Department of Social Science and also in the Department of Geography, so she's one of my colleagues, and we're very lucky to have her. She's also the Associate Director of Research from the Center of Refugee Studies, also here at York. And her research focuses on conflict and related human displacement, humanitarian emergencies, and refugee resettlement in Canada. And she has quite extensive research experience in many different parts of the world. So we're very happy to have her today. And today she will be speaking on the edges of war and sanctuary, genealogy of the border. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Libby. Thank you. You must be Chris.
Yes.
Chris, okay, thank you. And I, of course, then you asked me if you could record it, and I was a little bit less than enthusiastic. Now I realize I want to thank Chris and Libby for organizing this series, which has been really exciting. I've only been to some of the talks because I was on leave last term, but very exciting lineup. I didn't have a research project or a talk to give on borders, so that's why I lied and lobbied for the very last slot of the year. But I do want to talk today about the Kenya-Somali border, moving through a little bit of a theoretical framing to start with. And it's a border that I once knew somewhat well. Visited it first 20 years ago, and then about 15 years ago. Yeah, might as well. 15 years ago, was actually conducting the dissertation research, actually more like 17 years ago. I'm trying to fudge the numbers. But this is an opportunity for me to go back and look at that border again as I actually return physically and intellectually to do research again along that border and think about the refugee situation in Kenya, which is what I studied those 17 odd years ago. So I kept my same title. Now, I guess we have to go next. This will be how we do it. Oh, here comes another guy named Peter. All right, so what I want to do is bring, and many of you will have heard about this literature, it's not particularly new, but it's called the New Mobilities Paradigm, sometimes the New Mobilities Literature, to bear on borders. There's so much theoretical work done on borders, I had to try to figure out what my cut would be here. And then I'll do, in the second part of the talk, move to the Kenya-Somali border, unsettle it a little bit, and move on from there. This is my attempt at the embodiment of the writers. So we have little pictures of them so that they appear to you as humans and not just text. Lisa Malky is a well-known anthropologist from California, and way back when, some 20 years ago, talked about sedentary metaphysics and the idea of refugees as liminal. As liminal to the Westphalian state system, as liminal to the order of citizenship. A citizen stays within one's borders. Obviously, a refugee flees across one's borders in the absence of protection from a government. As she put it, though, refugees are organized through a technology of care and control for peoples out of place. So she was the first, I think, to think of a refugee camp as kind of a socio-spatial technology rather than as an essentialized site or an essentialized group of people who somehow share common characteristics. She very much brought, without referring to Foucault specifically, in my mind, a kind of biopolitical take to refugee studies. And she talked very much about representation as well. History tends to get leached out of the figure of the refugee as imagined by their administrators. Even I had something to say about the geopolitics of mobility way back in 1979 in Antipode. And I juxtapose the way international aid could get to refugees in a humanitarian emergency situation much more quickly than refugees themselves could get out of the region in which they were in. They may find themselves in a country adjacent to their own country, so they're out of immediate danger, but ultimately aid can get to them there more quickly than they can get to, for example, Toronto Pearson Airport, or perhaps to family members in another country who could support them in a more sustainable way. But basically, the argument is not new. Displaced subjects are supported or were supported and continue to be supported in regions of origin, which I'll return to later in the talk. The mobility of international humanitarian aid, then, is juxtaposed with the relative immobility of involuntary migrants. That was written in 1999, so it's slightly crude writing in the parlance of today, generating two distinct but related geographies. So now, just to give you a sense of what this sedentarist metaphysics, which is a very fancy word for a very simple idea, really, Tim Cresswell, a geographer, wrote that the metaphysics of sedentarism is a way of thinking that sees thinking and acting that sees mobility as suspicious, as threatening, as a problem. The mobility of others is captured, ordered, and emplaced in order to make it legible in a modern society. And I think the refugee is not only a liminal subject, but is emplaced, is registered, is documented, and is kept. Maybe not kept in a sort of closed institutional structure, but is kept in place as much as possible. An ordering of disorder, if you like. So now we're going to jump to John Urry, who's a sociologist at Lancaster University in the UK. And he, some time ago now, 12 years ago, we have to get to his little slide here, basically started making the argument that sociology was barking up the wrong tree. It shouldn't be looking at society as a fixed object of inquiry, so to speak, but rather it should be looking at mobility and at a more kind of relational matrix among places and people as its focus. And many of you will know, if you're in geography, the work of Doreen Massey, who came to this actually a little bit earlier than John Urry. But John Urry has taken it, I think, farther than Massey has in her work. Mobility, with its relational unfixed focus, should be the proper subject of the discipline. He contends that contingent ordering rather than static social structures and fixed social ordering are more analytically powerful and rupture our sedentarist assumptions. So, fine, he wrote that book. And then Mimi Scheller, his collaborator in 2006, the two of them went on to say that places are presumed to be relatively fixed, given and separate from those visiting. The new mobility paradigm, which again, how new it is another question, argues against this ontology of distinct places and people. Rather, there is a complex relationality of places and persons connected through performances. And when I read this article, I'm not all that satisfied with the unpacking of the word complex. Writing complex simply begs the question, well, if it's complex to you, then explain it to us. And performances, which is not in the sense of performativity, nor is it in the sense of Irving Goffman in sociology, so that still remains a little blurry to me. But again, I'm just giving you a quick sort of theoretical overview here. Here's Tim Cresswell, who's at Royal Holloway in London, another geographer, as I mentioned. And I think this quote is actually quite interesting. So from a theoretical perspective, mobility has become the ironic foundation for anti-essentialism, anti-foundationalism, and anti-representation. While place, territory, and landscape all implied at least a degree of permanence and flexibility, mobility seems to offer the potential of a radical break from a sedentarist metaphysics. And I think it's this radical break which is quite sexy to Mimi Schiller and John Urry and many of the people who are now writing, dozens and maybe hundreds of people who are now writing in what is the so-called new mobilities paradigm. So taking stock for a moment, I think the veracity and meaning of international borders may be unassailable in a realist and international relations sense. It's very hard to say that the border doesn't matter when we come down to, as we will in a minute, the Kenya-Somalia border, where a history of almost 100 years of containment, deprivation, intentional deprivation, I would argue, and conflict have really characterized this particular border. So while this sedentarist metaphysics, this notion that borders do count, even if they're part of the scramble for Africa and they're drawn by colonial powers between 1881 and World War I, there is something I think we can retrieve. I think we have to be critical of this kind of liberatory radical break business, but I think we can think through perhaps some ways forward taking this into account. So how might we do that? So rather than looking at the border as an object of inquiry, However, how can one analyze conflict, displacement, and deprivation as processes that move across and even shift the border, potentially producing other kinds of borders and boundaries? So I want to take another little, just a little side street here. This is Matt Spark. He gets a big picture because I know him, and he's a very nice guy. He's another geographer, and he also has talked about metaphysics much more critically than those whom I've just mentioned in his book, In the Space of Theory. Matt is very concerned that we take renderings, whether they be cartographic or textual, but he's particularly concerned about maps, because he's a geographer, too seriously, because there's a kind of presentist metaphysics embedded in them. And here's what he says in his book, in the introduction. When geographers and whomever else set out to describe a particular geography, and even more so when they invoke geography and space metaphorically, there's a metaphysics of presence at work, what might be called a metaphysics of geopresence, that fixates on the geo of a particular spatial pattern, and of spatial patterns here I'm referring to borders, or a particular poetics of location, while simultaneously downplaying the geographic diversity of the constitutive processes that produced it. So it's those constitutive processes that produce it that I want to try to focus on a little bit more, and the border itself as the pattern, the artifact of Westphalian state systems and so on, that I'll focus on. So for example, this particular map, while nice and neat, would be something that Matt might say, let's be cautious of such maps. For example, this one does not belie the colonial history. British East Africa, of course, stretched across Kenya and Uganda. Sudan was also a British colony. Somalia was held, at least southern Somalia was held by the Italians up until 1960. Ethiopia was occupied by the Italians, but never, and very proud of it, never actually colonized by anybody. So none of those histories are, of course, present on such a map. Dadaab is circled here because the book, Debbie Goodwin's book that it comes from, she's looking at the refugees who actually managed to get out of Dadaab camp and come to Canada as university students. It's kind of an interesting book. But so this is a very neat rendering, a map that we should be cautious about. I want to now move, too much text on this slide, but I want to move to Somalia and the Kenyan refugee camps in Dadaab. Why I'm really interested in returning to working at this border is because 1992 there was a combination of acute drought and war in south central Somalia, creating conditions of famine. And this led to widespread human displacement, including tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of refugees moving into Kenya. In 2011, it's like a deja vu. The worst drought in 60 years combines with complete political instability and rebel activity, not to mention the absence of a national government to counter such activities in Somalia, and the combination of acute drought and war. And of course, it's a bit of a play here. I've copied the text. The drought and war create conditions of famine leading to widespread human displacement. And again, another huge number of people, upwards of about 150,000 in 2011, crossed the border into the camps that now hold, by my latest count, or at least the statistic I could find yesterday, was 463,000. I've seen as high as 485,000 people in the camps in Dadaab. So, considering it's a very arid, or at least semi-arid place, this is a huge number of people. It's the single largest concentration of refugees in the world at the moment. Of course, it depends on how you count and how you want to render the Middle East and the displacement out of Palestine in 1947 and so on. But putting that aside, this is the largest single concentration of refugees under the purview of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Getting back to Doreen Massey, because a long time ago I did use her work on rounds of accumulation, which is a very Marxist analysis of really economic geography and how different rounds of economic activity could occur within a given location or site. I thought this is quite interesting in this example because you see different rounds of dispossession, economic as well as political dispossession going on. And in some other work I've done in Sri Lanka and in Indonesia on humanitarian disasters, I'm very interested in looking at dual disasters, at how environmental or atmospheric, climatic, people might call them natural disasters, of course no disaster is completely natural, intersect with wars and conflicts, and how together dual disasters shape both the aid landscape that follows the disaster, but also how it affects the people when, it's one thing to be displaced from war, but then to get smacked by a tsunami after you've already lost your house, the kind of devastation and multiple displacements that go on in Sri Lanka anyway, where I did most of the research, are quite acute. I don't want to speak about that too much today, but I do want to think about how, if at all, and if anyone, this was a talk that I gave at FES about a week and a half ago, is there a way methodologically to figure out how the capacity of people who remained in Somalia after the first event, how the war, how the drought at that time shaped their ability to stay or to leave Somalia when the 2011 situation occurred, both the intersection of drought and conflict. The conflict was really obstruction of aid delivery to some extent, both by the U.S., one could argue, I'll show that in a minute, and by Al-Shabaab, also known as the Youth, the rebel group operating in south-central Somalia. So I'll give you a bit more of that backdrop in a moment. So just to give you a little bit of the historical background, this is a province, actually, the northeast province of Kenya today. If you add on to the west of this region, a few little bits, Moyale, Marsabit, and Isiolo, that would constitute the northern frontier district, which, under British colonial rule, was, for all intents and purposes, the western boundary there was the border for Somalis who were Kenyan citizens and lived on that soil designated as red. They required a pass, just as in South Africa, to leave the northern frontier district. So you see a similar pattern to what was happening there. There's an extraordinarily long history, and I have all kinds of notes about, and I'm just going to show you in the next slide a few sort of salient points. But essentially, you have this border as a proxy, keeping safe the rest of the Kenyan state, and this, of course, is Somalia. This is 95% or more ethnic Somalis who are Kenyan citizens, but are, of course, not seen as full citizens, or first-class citizens, if you like to use someone like Cynthia Enlow's lingo, in their own country. And I'll get into a little more detail on that in a second. This is Mogadishu, and again, we need to be cautious of the map. Looks like a nice, looks even like a state of sorts. One could argue, is Somalia a state in the Westphalian sense with the central government and so on? And I'll answer that question in a second. Djibouti is here. A couple of reasons why we might want to question, the wholeness of this particular rendering of Somalia. Of course, up until 1960, the border was drawn here. This was British Somaliland. This was Italian Somalia. Today, Somaliland declares itself independent from Somalia. Puntland also declares itself autonomous. Some people recognize those entities, some do not. But ultimately, there is a border around the capital even, which I'll get into in a moment. 1977-78, the Cold War was played out here with Ethiopia and Somalia as proxies. Started out that the U.S. had backed Haile Selassie, who fell in 1974, but you had the U.S. backing Ethiopia in the Ogaden War. Somalia invades the Ogaden because guess what? It's occupied by ethnic Somalis, and they are marginalized by Ethiopia. Same story that we had, or that we'll hear about in a moment, in the bit of Kenya that we can see at the bottom of the slide. It's a fascinating Cold War story, because what happens is the USSR changes sides in the middle of the war, and all of a sudden starts helping Ethiopia. So then the US changes. Anyway, it's one of those, you use that in a lecture in political geography. It's not something that's seminal to what I'm trying to convey here, except to say that this is an extraordinarily dynamic region from the early part of the 20th century, when the pass system was enacted down here, to the 70s during the Cold War, and these declarations of independence have all happened in the 90s. So this is all very recent. So contested border, colonial, independence, and humanitarian meanings. I just want to give you one quick story that has always stuck with me. I remember standing with a pilot waiting to get on a plane, which I think is also an interesting note, that the international staff that are working or studying in these areas are almost always flying in. They're not driving in. I'll return to that point in a moment. But I said to this fellow, "Oh, have you been here long? Have you been doing this for long?" Or just chit-chatting. He said, "Oh, yes." He said, "I've lived here since the late 50s. I was a colonial administrator in the British in the period of British colonialism. But then, I was out of a job, so I started flying for safari companies." And so that was what he had done in his sort of interim period before the safari business had waned, and then he had started in on the humanitarian flying. And it struck me as an interesting kind of in terms of economic layers of livelihood, that he had engaged in all of those. Of course, safari and tourism enterprise being very much reliant on the colonial history and meanings and rehearsals of all of these things in many ways. But I talked about the British pass system. That was in Northern Frontier District. In the early 1960s, before Kenyan independence, which was 1963, the Kenyan government decided they should consult with Somalis living in Kenya and ask them, "Do you want to stay in Kenya, or would you like to become part of Somalia?" And the majority of them said, "We'd like to become part of Somalia." Then the British government went back to the nationalist party of Jomo Kenyatta, and Kenyatta was the first prime minister of independent Kenya. He had no interest in ceding 1 inch of territory to ethnic Somalis who might want to be part of Somalia, or to give any land over to Somalia, especially given this whole history of the pass system, discrimination and racism rampant, but also a sense of not being able to trust people living in that part of the country, and yet not willing to cede an inch of territory in the kind of conventional political geography sense of sovereignty. So Kenya said, "Fine, you can have your whole country," and I think that sparked what was almost a war between Somalia and Kenya. It was known as the Shifta War, but it was not. It wasn't a full-blown war. It was about as close to an all-out conflict as you could get without, tanks rolling in and the kind of Ogaden situation that occurred. But of course, the people who had said they'd like to leave Kenya felt betrayed. The people who were running Kenya felt that the people who had voted to leave were betrayers of the nation. So you had a very unstable situation there. Somalian irredentism, of course, they're trying to add the Ogaden, they're trying to add the Kenyan parts that are occupied by Somalis. And so Kenya just started to, counterinsurgency is perhaps a strong word, but just underserve. Bad roads, poor schools, not too much education, not too much healthcare. People, we'll keep them quiet, we'll keep them, we'll just not provide them with much, and they won't be trouble to us. So I talked about the Cold War proxies in the Ogaden, Somalia, the state that is not, and the independence efforts of Somaliland and Puntland. So those are some of the kind of historical bits that I could go on, and I'll see if we have, any interest in the audience on questions of the historical part. But I want to now talk a little bit about borders and refugees, because, of course, refugees are defined by the borders they cross. They're very much part of this modern, state-centric, international legal system whereby you cross a border, you prove that, you qualify for one of the 5 grounds of persecution, and then or in Africa, there's also the OAU Convention, which includes things like displacement because of conflict, colonially related disjuncture, violence, and so on. So refugees and borders are codependent. And as I say, refugees are at once an outcome of the border that they cross, defined by it. And this is sort of a homi bhabha, but homi bhabha can't be taken literally. That is to say that being on a certain territory is a kind of claim to it. And I think that the Somali irredentism that I was talking about, both in the Ogaden and in northeastern Kenya, was very much about, like, this is land occupied by Somalis. It's, and we have our people on that land, and that is one way that we're just telling you, we consider that land our land, regardless of where those legal borders are being drawn. And refugees, years and years ago now, 17 years ago, people told me, this land will one day be part of Somalia. So again, I'd like to go back and revisit some of those questions and see if there is any evidence to suggest that occupation is perhaps possession. But I won't dwell on that too much more here. So refugees are part of the sedentarist metaphysics that we've talked about, but increasingly, and you have to know I'm thinking out loud as we go through this. Oh my goodness, I want to go backwards. How do I do that? Okay, I have to go over here for a second. Just go backwards a couple slides. The notion of permanent temporariness is one that Adrian Bailey and his colleagues came up with, geographers studying Salvadorians in the U.S. And these are people coming to the U.S. who were never granted refugee status, but were given temporary protective status, TPS, 1 year at a time, over and over again. So after 10 years, they felt like they're in the state of, permanent temporariness. And I have to say that it's a good descriptor for these camps. This is one of the new sections of the Dadaab camps. In a moment, I'll show you a photo taken way back when the camps held about 100,000 people. But if you've been in a camp for 20 years at this border, do you fit the kind of sedentarist metaphysics? We know that it's to say, like, first-class citizens, and you have to have an address. You have to have a place that someone can send you your driver's license renewal or your tax form or your whatever it might be, your paycheck. But here you have people who have no legal status, except to say that they are refugees, who don't have a permanent home or a place that they can work, reside, rent a place to live, and so on. So what does that mean? Do they occupy something in between? There's certain features as refugees. They belong to the sedentarist metaphysics way of thinking. But the new mobility, or in this case, new immobility status that they have, which new is not the right word if they've been there 20 years, what does that say about the place that they're in? And again, those of you who know me will know that I'm interested in the situation of protracted refugee situations, but I'm tired of it as a kind of a descriptor. We can describe all we want, how many people are stuck where, for how long, but I want to kind of move beyond that, and any help you can give me in doing that, I would be most grateful for. So that's, for some reason, a blank slide. This was a picture taken in about 1994-95 of the Dadaab camps in the rainy season. It's a very green picture of what is now a far less treed landscape, but even at this time didn't have many trees. It's very green due to the rain. This area here was where the internationals were living. So, CARE was here, UNHCR was here. Dadaab town, when I first visited it in 1992, it had 3 phones, and it only consisted of this little strip right here. So all this was new, and I don't know who's living in these tents, but they'd be very, very hot. This is Ifo camp. Had about 40,000 people in it at the time. These are rub halls where where food is delivered to, and so on and so forth. So imagine, 5 times as many people. They've opened Ifo 2, which is now in this section here, and then there are 3 other camps in the works. So what other borders might we be able to think about? I want to move now to the Somali side of the border for just 2 minutes. Right now, the Somali state is governed, in theory, by the transitional federal government, the TFG, which is backed by governments like Canada, the US, Europe, and so on. It has little authority, so it's backed by the African troops or African Union troops, and really, beyond the capital, Mogadishu, it doesn't have much legitimacy. And so Al-Shabaab, who at one point, as recently as a year ago, controlled the capital, has now been pushed out, but they control most of south-central Somalia. That is to say, between Mogadishu and down to the border. And I mentioned OFAC here because it's so easy. The discourse in our media is that the reason that there was famine is that there was food aid in Somalia, but Al-Shabaab obstructed the delivery of that food aid to people who were suffering from drought. If you dig a little bit deeper, you'll also find that the food aid had to be monitored in such a careful way to ensure that it was not going to potential terrorists, Al-Shabaab being such a designated group, that the monitoring system prevented food from getting out of Mogadishu. So you have these borders which are very invisible, and actually, I'm having a little, your colleague at the University of Minnesota, who works on Somalia to some extent. That's right. So Professor Abdi Samatar was he was in part of a newscast that I was watching, and various professors and aid workers, both in Somalia and the U.S. and elsewhere, were very critical of OFAC because they saw that this was part of the reason of the famine. There was food on the ground, and there were ways to deliver it, but the bar was so high on the monitoring level that the the OFAC would not release it. Eventually, they loosened up their monitoring restrictions, and more food got out. But it was pretty interesting. It was sort of the backstory that got very little air time. But Professor Samatar has been involved in these transitional federal governments for as long as they've been going on. So just how relevant is the border? I think Al-Shabaab doesn't really notice or care that there's a border there. Many of you will remember that the World Cup that was being played in South Africa with those horns that we all remember so well, they actually blew up in Kampala a bar where people were sitting around watching that. And that was because of the Ugandan government's role in supporting the African Union with troops in Somalia. So they saw that as not something they liked. So they just went to Uganda and, used violence to instill fear and death. In 2011, actually the second half of 2011, which makes it even more stark, 4 people from Western countries were kidnapped from Kenya by people in Somalia. I say by people in Somalia because it's unclear whether those persons were Al-Shabaab or pirates, land pirates, or both. And I think that even those categories, I think it's very easy for me to say, oh, they were Al-Shabaab, or other people might make those claims, but I think they could, of course, be both. They could be one on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the other on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. But I think we have to be very careful not to impose those categories without a lot of evidence. So those 4 Westerners, 2 from Lamu, and 2 were doctors working with Médecins Sans Frontières, Spain, in the camps. And it's October 2011 that the 2 women Spanish doctors were abducted and driven across the Somali border, or at least a vehicle that they were abducted in was found quite close to the border. And I think they had a KISS movement, which is known where 2 vehicles meet, people switch over to the other one, off they go. So these 2 people have not been found or whatever at this point. I hope that they are released or something happens that is positive soon, because it's been a very long time. But after this second incident where the Médecins Sans Frontières doctors were abducted, diplomats in Nairobi, really, they were fed up because already, Westerners had been abducted from Lamu, which is a beach area for tourists, a couple, and actually one of them died of health complications while in captivity by the pirates/rebels. So the diplomats were criticizing the Kenyan government for not patrolling its border. Now remember, Al-Shabaab obviously doesn't really care too much about borders. It's not operating within them. It's moving around. But the Kenyan military, in what I call a show of silliness, moved into Somali territory with tanks and moved across the border onto Somali sovereign territory, incurring the wrath of the Al-Shabaab, who said that they were going to get revenge. And they have done so with these improvised explosive devices, with grenades, in and around the refugee camps. And very interestingly, Somali refugees have not been attacked. I think some have been hurt. But it doesn't appear that they are the focus of these attacks, but rather that it is Kenyan police and army that are being attacked, and several people have been killed, actually. So this is an odd moment where when the border comes into view or is called into question, Kenyan government is shamed in some way and through a show of force tries to kind of perform sovereignty or even a little bit of offensive sovereignty in both senses of the offensive word. Then all of a sudden we get pushback, we get revenge, and again, it's happening in Kenya. All of these IEDs, grenades, are in Kenya in the camps. So then you start to wonder, where is the border? And I could talk about that in the discussion. I don't want to go on and on, but there is a sense that that Westerners, that equipment, that resources, that Kenyan police or people that are attacking on the offensive are definitely the targets rather than people who are, for example, the same clan. And we can talk about that a bit later. But what to date in this talk, what kinds of conceptions of the border have we talked about? Well, Al-Shabaab, as I said, they don't seem to be at all bothered by borders. They cross them. They move through what are much pretty porous borders, let's say. Kenyan state, as far as, I don't want to oversimplify what I've shown you, but I think the Kenyan state has underserved the region of Dadaab, Garissa. There's actually an entire website dedicated to the quality of roads between Nairobi and the camps, the Garissa Road. And I did not pick the worst photo because I thought that would be just too strategic on my part. One of the photos is just, a mud bath with half water covering the road. But these are the roads in the fall. And this is the quality of the road that connects the capital with the camps. So you can see why people are mostly flying in. And you can also see that it would be hard to get away very quickly by vehicle, although there are these technicals and vehicles that do move over this kind of terrain quite quickly. But the Kenyan state has long felt that, I think, the Northeast province has been denied good access to roads. Hard for people to surprise them and move into Kenyan territory quickly. But at the same time, there is a bit of pride, state sovereignty. They will and they have never ceded an inch to Somalia. So the border is real in that kind of geopolitical sense. The international community, of course, operates, and again, international community is a problematic word, but for the purposes of thinking of the diplomatic community and so on, it's predicated on states as independent actors with representatives, and borders are fairly sacred, sovereignty is respected, and so on. So the border is real for them as well. For refugees, it's much more complicated. They are at once defined by the border, but they are living at that border in a way that that renders it a place almost, a temporary city. And on the one hand, they are very much part of IR discourse, the liminal subject. But in another way, this is an everyday place where, in many cases, an entire generation of people have been born. This is a place. They have made it into, you can buy cell phones on this side of the street. You can buy, flip-flops on the other side of the street. It's a place, and it's home to many of those people. So it's a much more kind of fraught and yet everyday experience for them. Refugees, as I say, are produced by borders. Place remains central to and salient in Western notions of ordering people, specifically refugees in conditions of long-term displacement. That's a paper that I wrote with Winona Giles from here at York as well. Skirmishes and trade continue across them. I haven't talked about trade, but it's really interesting because a lot of goods actually come across the Kenya-Somali border, and they all come across duty-free, which really raises the ire of the Kenyan government, whose own citizens are trying to purchase goods at the port and resell them at prices that can't compete with the Somali traders who haven't had to pay duty and are undercutting them. So that's long been, for already 2 decades, a bone of contention. So again, that border doesn't exist. I mean, it exists, but it's ignored. If you can trade better and you can use contraband imports, then people do. Geopolitics and militarization transpire in some of the ways that I mentioned, and yet the border region of the Northeast Province has been deprived of infrastructure and stability on both sides of the Kenyan-Somalian border for decades. So as I was thinking through this, I'm like, should you use the word buffer zone? It's so kind of cliche in conventional political geography and IR discourse. But I do see this region, this border is more of a region, and I do see it as a buffer zone. It's a place where family and certain groups of people who might be vulnerable, hurt, or sick could recover. If you're thinking about the conflict, it could be very functional to conflict on the Somali side. And for the Kenyans, by underserving it with hospitals or lack of hospitals, poor educational infrastructure, very poor roads, you keep a certain security of the rest of the nation, as was the case throughout much of the 20th century. So, last 2 slides, John Urry on complexity science. I'm not sure if this quite fits, but I thought it was a great quote. Complexity science investigates systems that adapt and evolve as they self-organize through time. Such complex social interactions have been likened to walking through a maze whose walls rearrange themselves as one walks. New steps then have to be taken in order to adjust to the walls of the maze that adapt to one's movement through the maze. And this notion of the maze kind of captured my attention because of the kind of maze of rules and routines that people in these camps have come to adopt, and they become second nature. So are the Dadaab refugee camps a kind of open detention site fortified by Urry's maze? I don't have answers to these, but is there a space for a new immobility paradigm? And I personally don't think that we need such a kind of declaration, but I think we might be able to learn more than I've put forth here from the new mobilities literature, because this has, again, been kind of a work in progress, very much so, over the last little while, to think through some of these ideas. Economic life has improved with the arrival of the refugee industry in Garissa and Dadaab, but these remain areas of acute deprivation, poor infrastructure, and as well as drought and conflict in Kenya. So will this region continue to be underserved as a kind of tactic of counterinsurgency and containment? That's a little easy to say. The MP from this district, his name is Farah. I had a chance to meet him, and he is actually the deputy speaker in the House of Parliament, and quite influential, trained as a lawyer abroad. I can't remember where, maybe Harvard or something. But he has brought a lot of visibility and some resources to this region. So he's trying to counteract this kind of... Counterinsurgency is not quite the right word. It's a little heavy-handed. But, drain the swamp and fish will die is not a bad analogy if you look around what you see in Nairobi and other parts of Kenya compared to this particular part. And finally, does 20 years of occupation by Somali refugees infer possession of a sort from the Somalia side? A good question. I spent a good bit of time this morning looking for the Homi Baba quote that I thought kind of captured this, but then, of course, Baba, as I say, is not to be taken literally when he says bodies are borders and such things. So I'll leave it there. Very preliminary kind of cut on this border, but I would be most interested in anyone's comments or thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.